I love the story of how people got where they are. I love the backstory of the superhero. I will often ask the question sort of like straight out of like, what brought you here? Like, why this? Like, I also like to ask about like, if you were doing something else, what would you be doing?
Superclusters is where we demystify the secrets, stories, and tactics behind the money that moves the venture capital world. Today, we are in for a treat. Susan Kimberlin is an active angel investor and capital allocator. She's an LP in funds you've likely heard of, from Backstage Capital to Forum Ventures to Operator Collective, and of course, a very special fund manager who introduced us, Amber Illig at the Council Fund. So thank you so much for the introduction, but also that you're building something really special about galvanizing a community of phenomenal operators to co-invest in diligence deals together with, where Susan also serves as a councilwoman. So, Susan, the more I look into your background, the more phenomenal it is, but also the more rabbit holes I seem to find myself in. And today will be the tip of the iceberg for a lot of things we could cover, because you have a wide variance in kind of things you're interested in. And so while you've spent 7.5 years at Salesforce leading search products, and I know our audience will get a kick out of this, you also run your own vineyard, Tammberlin Vineyards, which serves some of the best Pinot Noirs around. In addition, you have executive produced 2 independent films and have been singing in an a cappella group called the Loose Interpretations for almost 2 decades. And realistically, had this been the name of an investment group, I'm sure the lawyers would have had many billable hours around loosely interpreting terms. But nevertheless, I digress. We cover a lot today, including obviously GP staking, the concept behind that, how Susan approaches first conversations with GPs and how she thinks about building relationships, and of course, like I suggested at the very top, how a cappella has been a huge influence in Susan's life. So, lots to cover, and the shot clock's already started ticking. Susan, without further ado, welcome to the fabulous world of Superclusters.
Oh, thank you, David. I'm so excited to be here.
We've chatted quite a bit, prefacing this conversation, both in person and virtually, and one of the very interesting things I've come across, and I'll leave this as a kind of a lead, but I want to start by invoking a name, Mr. Lindsay. I'm curious how Mr. Lindsay left an indelible mark on your life.
Mr. Lindsay and the impact he had on my life started even earlier than when I got to work with him in high school. But he was the director of the Monte Vista Madrigals, which were a show choir, an a cappella show choir at Monte Vista High School in Cupertino. The Madrigals was a group of usually seniors, almost all seniors, that performed madrigal music, which is a Renaissance a cappella music format. Like 30 years, Mr. Lindsay got it up and running long before when I was in the Madrigals. It was near the end of his time teaching and running the group. But I knew about the group because in second grade at an assembly, I was sitting on the floor of the multipurpose room at Lincoln Elementary in Cupertino. And the Madrigals would come every year and do a Christmas concert. And there was a family friend, the son of a family friend, who was a senior in high school and was in the Madrigals that year. And I knew this kid. I mean, he was like, and it was such a big deal. It was such a because he was older, much older than me. And I was like, but I know him. So it was like, he's famous because he's in this group. And like, I always looked forward to the Madrigals coming and singing every year. And so at that moment in second grade, I was sitting there, saw our family friend David singing. He waved at me and I was like, I want to be in the Madrigals. Just setting the goal and then achieving it of getting into the group was formative for me. And then Mr. Lindsay himself, having built this group and worked with a new crop of kids every year to create a professional grade group of performers with about 20, usually between 20 and 24. We had 22 my year. It took a special kind of dedication. It was also it was pretty serious training, and Mr. Lindsay expected a great deal of us. And he also believed that we could deliver on those expectations. He believed that we could do those things. And by expecting a whole lot from us as like high schoolers, um, and also showing that he really knew that we could do it, I think it inspired us to stretch ourselves if we were, like if it wasn't necessarily our first instinct, or if there was something that was hard about it. Um, and I think that's been incredibly helpful. Like it's been an incredibly helpful, informative experience to have somebody that really was like, that knew that what he was asking for was hard, and also knew and clearly communicated to us that he thought we could do it. Having somebody believe in you when you're trying to do something that you're not sure you can do is incredibly, incredibly powerful. So I love that. He also was a character. He was a gay man who had grown up in like Midwestern, like Midwestern farm country. And he, at a time when that was, there was not a lot of acceptance, and there was not even, sort of acknowledgement. And he was unapologetically himself and had all these great stories, and did not was unruffled by people who might be disapproving or might be judging or might not believe in him. And that was an incredibly powerful example to me as well, because it showed me at a really formative point in my life that being different is not only is it okay, but also can be a kind of advantage, because it lets you do things that are also different and often bigger than kind of the status quo.
And it's also like I've never done a cappella, but having listened to a cappella, the range of like the basses to the sopranos, effectively, you really need
Mm.
a diverse vocal range, but also like there is no, at least you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but there's no voice that can overpower any other voice, because every voice matters in making the song, the music sound more holistic.
It literally does not work unless everybody is pulling their own weight or doing their job, or however you want to think about it. There is no part that is extra or extraneous. That's one thing. I think it also actually teaches you a lot, especially with like performance music. Like what we do, the sort of like the one of the main goals of it is to get up in front of an audience and perform, right? And so I've always thought with a cappella in particular, and music and performance in general, it takes a really like it takes a balance, or like a conflicting like relationship, like intention of playing well with others, like really cooperating, so like making sure that you are doing something that works with what the person next to you is doing and everybody around you is doing, and also having the confidence and like the ego to think like, I am good enough to stand up in front of an audience and sing and have people listen to me. Like both
Right.
are true. And so like one is like it's me, and the other is it's everybody else. And like holding those two things, and having them, like, even though they're like, there's a tension between them, holding those two things and having that both things going on at once, I think is great mental training, and like is an important like piece of the experience overall. Very balanced. I love balance too. I love like
The yin
the
and
ebb and
yangs, yeah.
flow, and yeah, that, because like you're never at a 5. You're always at like 3 or 7, right?
Right.
Maybe you're at a 10 sometimes, maybe you're at a 1 in all things, but you don't exist. Nobody exists in the middle.
Right. It's
Like
like a
our whole
pendulaic
experience is like,
swing
yeah,
that you go
yeah,
between phases, so to speak.
yeah,
Um, I I want to double click on something about
yeah.
Mr. Lindsay in particular. And you said something along the lines of he was really good at communicating. He had high expectations for you, but continuously, despite having high expectations and knowing the journey was going to be really tough, he believed that all of you could get there. And I'm curious if you remember, I know this is a couple decades back, but how he communicated that with you. Was there a stylistic format? Was there a way he communicated with you that you've carried on maybe into your own life today, or still remember fondly of during your time as a senior in high school?
There was both the reputation of the group and like his own the way that he talked about the group and the way he presented us to our audiences, that like this was that we were very good. It was hard to get into the group. That's what it is. It was like a really good product, that we were producing. And that like that takes a lot of work, and that also that and a certain amount of talent, and that is one of the reasons why people should and did appreciate it. So almost like pride in what he was doing, and the way he presented it to our audiences, and we could see that he was proud of us, and we could get, that's one of the things about performing too. Like you get a lot of approval and validation from audiences because they're appreciative,
Right.
generally. So it's always interesting when they're not. Had some of those experiences over the years as
Oh,
well.
wow.
And so that was one thing. He was clearly proud of us. He clearly he had built this reputation for the group, and he thought that we as a group could deliver on maintaining that reputation. It's also an identity thing. Like a uniform should gives you that context of like, I'm in this uniform, and I do this activity in this uniform. I totally do I don't jog, but I do the thing where I put on the workout gear as like the first set of clothes that I wear in the morning, kind of thing. So that so that I'm ready, and that like I don't get to take it off until I've done the workout, kind of thing.
Interesting. It's funny that you mentioned that, because there's a part of my past where I was a competitive swimmer, and swimmers are known for their 5 a.m. practices in the morning. And I know I it's a different world altogether. I know I'm Asian. I will look like this until I'm 59, and by 60 I'll be like all wrinkly and like a prude and all that. But when I was younger,
land into like aging. Woo, rough.
It's a rough. I've seen it, at least for my family members. It's a rough cycle. There's like a cliff. It's like everyone looks super young, like they plateau, and it's like they continuously look about like probably mid to late 30s, and then they hit like 60, 65 years old, and it's like straight downhill. It's like a steep decline. But I bring that up because in my past as a swimmer, because of our 5 a.m. practices, and this is back in like high school and middle school and all that, I would often wear my swimsuit to sleep. Is it completely hygienic? Is it like I don't know? I don't know. I don't know, to be completely honest. I did whatever as a kid, but it also was like, hey, you know what? Like, because sometimes for competition as well, we'd wear these like skin tight suits that, I kid you not, take like 10 to 15 minutes to put on in general. It was just much easier to have it on you. And so as soon as you got to the pool, you just like took off your clothes and you jumped straight in.
Yeah.
But maybe there was a level of
5 in the morning?
I know.
Like, what is the water temperature? I'm
pools
having so many
are heated,
thoughts.
to be completely honest. I mean, you and I both grew up in California and in the Bay Area, right? Like the Bay Area doesn't get like that cold, even in winter, maybe at worst like high 30s.
I'm thinking that moment between like, between like getting the thing up. Well, I guess then that's a better, even greater argument for like, just be ready so that you can get into the water as fast as possible.
Exactly. Well, I will be honest, like the hardest part about swimming is jumping into the pool. It's not actually the practice itself. I mean, some people may disagree. This is my contrarian take here. The hardest part is just like getting into the pool in the first place. Flip side, second hardest part is getting out of the pool, because it's so warm in the pool and you get out, it's like freezing
then it's
cold.
like, well, and you've been working out, so like, you're like, now you're like, the blood's flowing.
Exactly. Anyways, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but you've also gone to high school with 2 Michelin-starred chef like Stuart Brioza as well.
Yeah.
And so, given the kind of people you surround yourself with, is there something you picked up at an early age when it came to recognizing excellence and drive in others?
That's a deep cut with high school, having gone to high school with Stuart. Although Stuart was a lot older than me, but I was friends with his younger brother, Adam. And I'm also like a huge foodie and really into restaurants and hospitality. So it's like, it's very exciting, but it's also like a kind of a small world thing, which happens to me a lot also, in the venture community, where I'll be like, oh, we actually overlapped in this way, or, you know, or there's something sort of coincidental, that we have in common. And that helps like build connections and relationships with people, I think, which is great. Recognizing drive and excellence. I mean, I think recognizing excellence is the more straightforward of the two, because usually there are some kind of agreed upon markers of like success and things that are working. In building businesses, you can see, whether a business is growing, whether people are buying the products and services, or you're able to or the business is moving toward being, like breaking even or even becoming profitable, those kinds of things. Recognizing drive is different, so much more kind of subjective. To see it like early on, I think is harder, because it's like a little less measurable, or maybe a lot less measurable, because it's kind of like the ability to like come back and like keep trying and keep pointing towards the same goal, and finding ways to like pursue that goal. If one thing doesn't work, like shift to something else. Find ways to do it. It's not like not everything works all the time. So I see that. I often see that in like founders and in GPs. They have values and they have like a mission in mind, usually pretty clearly stated. Sometimes it it gets tuned up over there, especially because if you're meeting somebody very early on in their journey, it takes a while to kind of like tighten that up and like be able to articulate it. I think of this as like, how tight is the thesis when you're like first out there like pitching your new fund. Like a tight thesis is really important, but it refines. You get feedback from people, like stuff lands, stuff doesn't land. The way you talk about it changes. Maybe also like some of the actual like parts of it change materially, and that's okay, because not like because adaptation is important too. There's clarity around like what their value system is, and also like what their goal is, like where they're heading, their why are they doing this. So that's kind of what I look for and like probe on. I'm more inclined to in order to evaluate drive and recognize it, I'm more inclined to like get into the like, well, how did you get here? What were some of the like significant steps along the way for you? What sorts of outcomes are you driving at? And like, what's your values framework for like, what's your values framework that's supporting you along the way toward that?
And in your experience, have there across fund managers, founders, what are some good examples of why that were compelling to you?
If you take Arlen Hamilton, for example, for any example that I give, it's going to be my take, and like there's probably more to it. Right. Or maybe it's a little bit different. So
everyone's mileage may vary, but nevertheless,
take it with a grain of salt, or like understand that it's my lens on it. But her her why and her like what was driving her when I met her, she could see like the possibility of creating new businesses, new products, and like creating returns, like gains, in venture. And she was seeing it from the outside, and outside looking in with like this very different perspective. She was trying a lot of different things. Some of them weren't working, and she was coming back and trying again in a different way. Because like the pitch process for her with me, it was like a 6-month thing. It wasn't like I met her and was like, oh, this is great, let's do it.
Right.
I kind of got close to yes like several times. And I think also it was really clear that what she wanted to do was get in, like she was outside and she wanted to get inside venture so that she could like exercise the kind of or not exercise, but maybe like reap the benefits of like the work of like finding and investing in and cultivating a portfolio and then getting returns on that. And also kind of show that it can be done by someone that's very different,
Mm-hmm.
and give access to people that were outside like her to, and like bring them in, was like pretty, which I found very compelling and is like a sort of a cornerstone of my investing thesis and all the investing that I've done since starting. So there was a lot of like alignment, and then also like I've, used her as inspiration, and using what she's doing as inspiration as well.
You've talked about this a couple times, which is, and she's talked about this as well. Actually, like on her end, I think she's talked about like 6, 7 times across many different media platforms and all that. And she's,
Hmm.
as you know, you guys found each other at a place when she was still figuring a lot of things out at Backstage Capital. And one of the things I stumbled across as I was listening to some of her interviews is that you put in, I believe, a 50K check into Backstage Capital. And you were the founding LP, meaning you were the first LP in like not even the first institution, like you were the first LP in Backstage Capital. But the 50K part I found to be very interesting because to me there was something unorthodox with how you were allowing her to spend the capital, which was, and this is what I've heard, so feel free to set the record straight, which is $25,000 in operating capital and $25,000 in investable capital, which is usually not how an LP check is archetyped, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
Could
Hmm.
you walk us through the thinking of why you came to that decision and why that 50K check was structured in that way?
Yeah. Yes, I can. And I will preface it by saying that there was not a lot of like intentionality actually around that. That was more
Okay.
an artifact of like, what was going on. The first check was, so it was two different checks. The first one, the founding LP check was 25K. That was investable capital. That was the sort of investable capital piece. And then the second one was actually like several months later. Um, and it was actually a portion of her GP stake. So it was actually like buying into the management company essentially. Before that was even really a thing,
Right.
if you will. And it was like definitely born of necessity. So I was like, Arlen knew more about, arguably, like definitely still does know more about creating funds, fund management, et cetera. She had been studying for a while, and this was my first fund investment, and I was still also relatively new to angel investing at the time too. So I was learning by doing and learning on the fly and learning a lot from her. And the first check was literally just like she needed something to open the doors. I mean, she like to the point that she needed to like open a bank account for like to be able to deposit the money into that was like associated with the fund. It was really clear to me that as she was like going through starting to fundraise on the back of like having that first check from me, that like in order to be able to do that, there needed to be some operating capital as well.
Yeah.
And she came up with the idea of having it be like for a part of the carry essentially. All of that has been restructured since, but I think but it really made sense to me. And then this is something that I actually see with first time fund managers and people who are breaking into venture from somewhere very different,
Mm-hmm.
which is a key part of like what I look for in managers, by the way. But I like there is the actual cost of spinning up a firm and and your day to day like you have to figure that out kind of on your own. If you have like a classic sort of like 2% fee structure, and let's face it, like a lot of first time fund managers are starting with smaller funds that are like sub 10 million or sub 25 million, and 2% of that does not pay your rent in most places. let alone like the cost of like actually running the fund operations. So this is like a real challenge that I think about when I think about emerging managers and I'm interested in, that like operations, you have to figure out how to like make that work. So I loved that she was like getting creative and like offering like compensation in the form of like a stake in like the outcomes later
Yeah.
by selling like a small portion of the GP stake to me. So that's actually like why there were two different tranches and they went to two different things. It was literally like necessity. And that was sort of the story of that was like the story of early Backstage generally is like just got to figure something out. It's not going to look like, it's not going to look like what everybody else is doing generally, but it's because like that's what we got to do.
Yeah.
Um and I always really appreciated that.
And on that note, for the uninitiated at least, could you like walk us through the bifurcation or at least the difference between buying into the LP and buying into the GP? Because I imagine for a lot of folks who are listening, that is fairly new phrasing and or vocabulary to them.
Basically, like becoming an LP is putting money into the fund that's going to be invested into the companies that that fund manager finds, diligences, decides to invest in. And then as an LP, you get proportionally to how much money you put in, you get returns, whatever the multiple is on the fund, back out. So if you put in your like, say you put in 100K and the fund ultimately returns like 3x, then you'll get 300K out at the end, plus or minus all the things like taxes, fees, etc. But you're putting in quote unquote investable capital, so that that money is invested and then is generating the return that comes out. When you put money into the management, I think you can call it putting money into the management company. You can call it buying GP stake, or I think like people also say selling GP points. You're actually you are putting money in to the kind of the business management part if you're buying into the management company, um, and uh, or into or buying a share of the carry, which is the like the profit, the portion that the management company or the fund managers themselves, the GPs, the general partners, are going to get, that is their like cut of the overall profits that they get in addition to just benefiting proportionally to like how much gains there are.
And a good way to think about it is there's like the firm and then there's the fund, right? Like an emerging manager might raise a fund one, then a fund two, then a fund three, and onwards kind of thing. And then usually when you're investing in kind of the LP, the limited partnership, you're investing in the individual fund, like fund one, fund two, fund three. In investing into the GP or getting GP points or whatnot, you are investing into the firm, which manages all the other funds. And so you get a cut from subsequent, carry and all that kind of stuff as well, which transcends.
It's also sort of,
yeah,
like it's buying into like everything that they're doing as well.
Yeah.
So like across funds and across anything else they might have going on, like if it's an accelerator or they have like an incubator or like a studio where they've got like businesses that they're like building and spinning off that they own.
It's actually really interesting. And at least anecdotally, I echo a lot of what you say, which is like it's GP staking has gotten a lot more popular. Like give or take 5-10 years.
So you're
back,
seeing it too.
I'm seeing it too. And it's actually really interesting. And I'll probably have a couple of them hopefully on for season 4 when they're done fundraising. Which is I've seen a number of fund of funds start doing GP staking as part of their business strategy. It's also this interesting thing. Like if usually in the past, LPs have been rather reticent to GP. Anyone who has a GP stake who doesn't normally take a GP stake, it's like, wow, you have extraordinary ownership in the brand that is being built. And the worry for a lot of LPs is like, are you deploying against your own strategy or are you deploying against like someone else's strategy? And at some point, are you working for someone else that is external to our own interest as a limited partner, right? So that's been the large worry. But over time, we've seen a lot more people like consistently do GP stakes. And a lot of it is for outsiders who want to become insiders, and they need like, 100K, 150K in fund expenses to really get the fund off the ground, give or take.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I've seen a lot of fund to funds start doing that. And because it's equity in the management company, that fund to funds, because usually fund to funds are 1 in 10 or 1 in 5 or something, like what that means is 1% management fees and like 5% carry or up to 10% carry. That's usually the structure for fund to funds. And I won't say I'm not an expert here. I'm just saying, like, here's what I'm seeing in the market.
You're like, this is sort of,
And
the typical case.
And what I've started to see, at least like end of last year, this year, is as new fund to fund managers are popping out, because they're taking GP stakes, they've started taking 1.5 management and 15% carry, or even 2 and 20, which is a traditional, like if you invest in a VC fund, it's like 2% management fee, 20% carry.
Yeah.
But they're justifying the additional management fee and carry because they're taking ownership in the management company and not just the individual fund in which they're investing into, which I find to be pretty interesting.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Sorry, I was getting a little caught up. Okay, that makes sense. I mean, it is an interesting. There's the piece about how the management company works and how carry works when you're talking about investing in GP. So you're investing in funds and like in a fund of funds where like the GP of a venture fund that's investing directly into companies is already taking fees. There's already like their like profit and carry. And then if you are a fund of funds, so you're investing into those venture funds and you also have like your own like fee structure, profit carry.
Yeah.
Then like it's kind of it's definitely a disincentive for investors to want to put money into a fund of funds and then have like twice the like fees and everything.
Right.
So I'm not at all surprised that like that people are getting creative with that. I'm not sure that like what you're describing actually like tackles that problem of like fees on fees that like
no, the problem still exists.
But it's just,
there was an April Fool's joke, I forget who put it out there, which was like, hey, we're launching a fund of funds of funds of funds, which is fees on fees on fees on fees.
Yeah, so like you'll be getting like a quarter of what the 100x returns or whatever. Yeah, I don't know. Like maybe it works out, but probably not. Yeah, so I think that there's an interesting like psychology around that piece. But I think also like I do think that like taking a stake in the management company, or like buying part of, or like having like part of the carry, as like an investor is a great incentive to align, or is a great way to align incentives so that like you're supporting the manager because you actually have some skin in the game of like how the firm does over the long term, in addition to like how each individual fund works. And I think it's definitely like two different profiles of investing. Like the investing in a fund is more like a single asset, whereas investing in a management company is more like investing directly into like a business that you want to see grow.
Absolutely.
There's also like a beginning and end to a fund, and there's not, as much as clearly that for like a management company.
Right. And it starts leading the way. And I'm gonna be honest, I am not the most educated, and these are deeper waters than I'm qualified to talk about, to be completely honest. But this starts getting into the territory of fund to funds and LPs building out evergreen funds, because that's
interesting to me.
Yeah. So I'm not going to say too much on that. I'd rather get an expert on there who actually can speak a little bit more about evergreen funds. Probably like,
I will be listening to that episode. I've been digging into it a little bit because I think there's a certain like the sustainability, like from my understanding of like the concept, the sustainability of looking after the operations, and like reinvesting your gains so that you're accomplishing what your like goals, what your thesis is trying to accomplish in the world alongside economic returns, I think is doing good in like the overall ecosystem. So trying to, and I always encourage also like with direct investments and with startups, I'm like, like raising money is important. And building a business that like is more sustainable, where you're actually taking in enough revenue to be able to run the business, is, I think, also critically important, because that at the end of the day is like what a business should do. And also then you're not like fully dependent on something that is like somewhat synthetic for like making your business grow. It depends on like what the business is, etc. But like the idea of an evergreen fund, I think it sort of encourages it encourages the fund managers to like think about building a sustainable model for themselves, and then also I think allows them to focus on what outcomes they're trying to get in whatever area they're working in. That makes sense.
I agree. And part of this, would like, obviously, Sequoia is less of a fund of funds, but more of like a venture fund altogether. They have an evergreen model. Sapphire as well, which probably got to bring Beezer back on to talk about this kind of thing. But in the theme of like evergreen funds, part of it is like you just put capital into this large pool of money, and you can, like, it's not completely liquid, but there's for LPs at least, there's a more liquid kind of like distribution, depending on how distributions are done on an annual, every other year, kind of whatever basis kind of thing. And on top of that, you can design like, oh, if I'm investing in this evergreen structure, that evergreen structure then distributes, I've seen this case, into other funds that might be more interesting for you as like different verticals you want to double down on, whether it's enterprise or deep tech or something else and all that.
Oh, interesting. It's a little, kind of lets you like be a little bit more flexible in where you're directing the capital, and or like
there are some, it really depends on the fund, right? Like some are like, hey, you can decide and earmark what verticals you want your capital to go to. There are other funds that are like, we decide for you, and our only job to you is to get you top quartile returns. That's it, right? So it does vary. And once again, I'm not the perfect person to ask here, but I think it lends itself to a very interesting future of where financial funds might look like as people become more innovative in nature. To switch gears a little bit over here, I'm actually curious on so there's a thing I stumbled across where, and I want to harken back to the costume element of this and go back to like the madrigals and the costumes. And the context here is there's a great talk by Josh Wolf that I like to revisit every so often. I think he did this back in like November 2019 for his like annual dinner. So Josh Wolf, Lux Capital, and he explains that the world is constantly in this battle between deception and detection. From job interviews to VC startup interactions to Hollywood actors and all that kind of stuff, it extends to multiple parts of our lives. And for you as someone, and this is probably a more interesting way of how we're weaving things together, but as someone who has like put on costumes and Renaissance costumes for madrigals, and as someone who's been a sugar spun angel in the production of the Nutcracker when you were 11,
oh my God,
how do you think? Right, it's a blast from the past, deep cuts. How do you think about the costumes and layers of fund managers trying to put their best foot forward with you when they come to pitch you for the first time? Because there's a layer of, I wouldn't call it like outright evil deception, but there's a level of deception of, I'm only going to share what looks great to an LP like yourself, or to like an angel investor like yourself.
I think, all of us want to put our best foot forward.
Yeah.
Especially if we're trying to accomplish something. When we meet, but even just like meeting somebody new, you want to put your best foot forward. And it's pretty high stakes, I think, if you're out there actively fundraising, and the goal of the interaction that you're having is like, you're coming to somebody and saying like, basically asking for approval, put money into my fund.
Yeah.
So I'm aware and empathetic, that like there can be a lot of pressure, and that like, people are putting on are like, are working hard to impress me or anyone that they're talking to. It's not about me. It's about like what they're trying to accomplish. And the fact that I'm in the, like, that they're pitching me. And also, and I think it's important to like be prepared. So like having put in the time, like you thought about it, you put like a presentation, if you're, that's what you're doing together. You thought about how to articulate what you're doing, and polished it, maybe practiced it. I think that like putting in the care, like taking the care to put in and putting in the work to do that is important, because that's a part of doing the job that shows that both lets you develop building the firm, gives you like reps, gives you practice at like, what to think about, and how to representation, how to represent it, and helps like sort of solidify it in your mind.
And I'm curious to make this more concrete. I'm not saying that there's a template like this out there. I don't know if you have a template or not. I imagine you may not have, or most people may not have. Are there questions or topics you would like to get a better understanding of to help you better relate with the individual who is pitching to you?
I love the story of how people got where they are.
Mm-hmm.
Like I love the backstory of the superhero. Like, like there's a reason why Wonder Woman is out there doing what she's doing. She's one of my, like, Wonder Woman is like, as the superhero I most relate to, because she's like in her mild her mild mannered like real world identity is as a linguist,
Uh-huh.
which is my training
You're
as
bad bad.
well. And she's Wonder Woman, so she's like very badass.
Oh yeah.
But like there's, like there's the how they got there and who they are. And so I will often ask the question sort of like straight out of like, so like, what brought you here? Like, why this? Like, why, why like AI for like targeted marketing, or why, which is, I mean, even that's like a little bit technical. Usually I'll back up and be like more like, how did you end up in tech, or why did you start this business or decide to raise this fund instead of doing something else.
Right.
I also like to ask about like, if you were doing something else, what would you be doing?
Right.
Because I think that is like incredibly indicative. You can learn a lot from people when they tell you, like, if they had infinite resources and infinite time, what they would be doing with it. The creative endeavor of like articulating what you would be doing if you were not, doing this with yourself, I think is like just paints a really vivid picture.
I'm curious, as like probably my last question before we go into like the closing questions, so to speak. I call them quick fire. I need a better word for it, but they're not really quick fire.
It feels so soon. Yeah, the quick fire.
It feels so soon.
Yeah, the 10 quick fire questions where I was like, oh, I could do like 15 minutes on each of these.
I know. They're all like
it's hard to give a quick answer.
I know. I hear you. Probably just like, I'll call them human questions or whatever they're like. I need to figure out a better term for it. But
Sure.
Before we get into that, I'm curious. You are like the only individual LP, like, high net worth individual as an LP, as a capital allocator that I've had on the show so far. Things will change over time because we'll have more, and I think that perspective is really interesting in and of itself. But I'm curious how you think about portfolio allocation as an individual.
There's kind of two fundamentals. Like there are two foundational pieces. One is that like I have my general thesis about wanting to invest in things that are good and useful, and I work on a lot of different kinds of projects, and invest in a lot of different kinds of things, and they all fall into my definition of good and useful, but there's a lot of different like types of investments, if you will. So so the first thing is always that it needs to be sort of within that bucket. Another thing that's kind of a fundamental about it is that like when you're investing your own money, it is a totally different thing than investing somebody else's money. So having invested almost entirely only out of my own capital, the risks I can take and the freedom of the choices that I can make, I don't have investors to answer to, and I don't have like LPAs, and so I think that the way that I go about doing it is probably higher risk and like with less structure maybe than I would do if I was investing other people's money, right? And while I definitely like aspire to raise a fund and or work with folks that are institutional investors in directing their capital into emerging managers, like specifically, like that's something that's like on my, like, that's where I'm headed with everything that I'm doing these days. I am like well aware that like there's a big delta between like what I can do if I am the only person, me and like maybe sort of my family and like those whose money it is that I'm like working with, are my immediate family and like, or versus like investing the money of institutional investors. That being said, I think that like I'm interested in portfolio construction when I'm looking at venture funds that I want to invest into. Like I'm interested in how they are thinking about what types of companies at what stage, like how much to put into them, so that they get like the return profile that they are looking for. And while my direct investment, or sorry, not my direct, but my fund investments have been all in a similar category of like venture funds, early stage for the most part. I know that like investing in later stage and or like private equity and or like foundations and endowments all have different ways that they approach risk. They have different kinds of assets they are looking at. They are trying to balance across a broader range, and so that those are things that you like want to think about as well. I do trade off, or I do like balance what is the actual product or impact on the world that something is having against what like return to expect. So, executive producing independent documentaries is not a high, like, does not have a probability of high gains, right? But the impact of those documentaries being seen by people, and potentially like catalyzing and galvanizing change in the world is incredibly valuable. So that to me is worth it.
Yeah.
It's hard to assign like dollars to all of that.
Yeah.
But also probably an exercise that would be like, good for me and is probably a good exercise to do. So like, I'm all for like a thoughtful and strategic like strategy. And I'm like learning all the time. I actually use your podcast as a way to like learn about like the profile of and strategy of other kinds of institutional LPs, because it's incredibly helpful. And also like feel like I'm in like really interesting company.
I'm with you as well. I mean, part of the excuse to do this podcast is for me to put on my learning cap and learn from people who are much smarter than myself, including you. And I've been incredibly fortunate to be able to learn from some of the best folks in the industry. Susan, as we're rounding out to the end of this, and I want to be cognizant of time, I would love to ask like one last question in the grander scheme of things. And there's something that's been like, I think you teased, whether you knew it or not, you teased this like probably 10 minutes ago, give or take. I don't remember the exact timestamp of it, but you said something along the lines of, if you would ask the question to kind of founders, fund managers, if you were doing something else that isn't this, what would you be doing? Right. And so I'm curious,
Yeah.
from founding one of the most popular, if not the most popular a cappella group in UC San Diego, to investing in Snuggies Trash Pies, known for their crazy banana pants decor in SF, to building a MacGyvered sous vide system in your kitchen, to becoming a Trekkie in high school after watching Star Trek: The
Oh
Next
boy.
Generation, to executive producing two documentaries like you mentioned earlier. What takes the cake if you were to give a TED Talk on a creative pursuit or rabbit hole that is not emerging managers or startups?
Oh gosh. I mean, you can tell I'm interested in a lot of things. And I am like so lucky that I can pursue a lot of them. I also see a through line through all of it as well, like touching back to that like good and useful thesis. But I mean, thinking also taking the TED Talk format into account. There's a few things that I would be like would love to like geek out on. Um, the I think I mentioned earlier somewhere, and you can sort of find it in my my online presence as well. I trained in linguistics, um, as in like I studied linguistics, and I've used it over the years. It's been an interesting journey with the rise of like machine learning and AI and natural language processing. When I started, it was not cool to be like a linguist in like tech, and it is now. So that I got lucky, maybe, or also or like the world came around to see how great what I was doing was. And I think like I've always been fascinated by modes of communication. So relationships between people, I think, is probably like one of the most fundamental like drivers of the way we behave, like as a species in life. And also something that sets us apart from all other animals, except for honeybees, is our ability to communicate abstract concepts to each other. So if you take those two things together, the communication between us is like kind of the definition of our experience in the world, I think. And I think it's really interesting. I think that like communication between people sort of exists on a spectrum, ranging from like being in the same like physical space talking to somebody all the way to like maybe writing a letter and like a handwritten letter and sending it via snail mail. And it's changed. But it's also changing rapidly because we are more connected than ever. We can do things like text each other, or like make a voice recording or a video and send it to each other. Like live in real time communication versus asynchronous communication is interesting to me, and what the amount of synchronicity, if that's a word that I could apply to this, what the amount of synchronicity in the communication is and how it affects like how it impacts the effectiveness of the communication, and what parts of like building the relationship between people and or like leaning on the infrastructure of the relationship between people like it requires, I think is super interesting. Like if I were to like go off and get a PhD, which I'm not going to do, but if I were to, that's the kind of thing that I would be interested in. And that I think, and what I could pull out of that then would tell us something about how humans can relate to each other, and how we can also use all of the like information that's available to us in the world now, would be like that would be my TED Talk. I think that would be a TED Talk.
I
Anyway, I would be into that.
Well, let me know if you do that TED Talk. It's something I've been one of the rabbit holes I've gone through, and I would actually say inspired by you. As I was doing homework for this conversation and I saw your linguistic background, I started just like
Oh,
looking up
nice.
things in linguistics in general. And one of the things I came across is this, I think it's called conlang, CONLANG, which I forget what it stands for, but in my mind, I kind
Yeah.
of equate that to constructed languages, where there is a community of folks on Reddit and on social
Oh.
media and like in the linguistics world, where they go about creating their own language from scratch, and the
Mm-hmm.
nuances in different ways and how people communicate, and is fascinating. There's one I saw on Reddit where the conlang, I think, was called koi lang or something, where the language to, like, talk to someone in is literally drawings of koi fish and puddles, and it is probably the most artistic language I've seen.
Amazing.
Yeah. So anyways, that was inspired by you.
Yeah. So I mean, part of what got me into linguistics, which ultimately led me to where I am today, is Klingon in the world of Star Trek is an actual language, like, created by linguists. And that was fascinating to me. Esperanto is another one, like, it's like that was actually, like, created for purpose, and to help to like try and create a common language that everyone in Europe could speak together. And like bringing it back to Star Trek, William Shatner actually, like, made a film, or maybe 2 films, that was entirely in Esperanto, because he was, like, involved somehow in, like, the people that were creating Esperanto, trying to, like, create it. But if you like, and also things like programming languages, any kind of, like, syntactic or symbolic system is a language. Like, when we call them programming languages. Also, music notation is a language. Like, it's a way to, like, capture the, like, how the structure of how something is supposed to flow. It captures an abstract concept, and it is mutually understandable by multiple people, multiple parties. That's the definition of language.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that stuff is, like, that's, like, truly fascinating. So yeah, I love that. I'm gonna go off and, like, check out the concept of conlang and get right into Reddit, because that seems like
I can send you some
fun.
stuff.
I think synthetic languages are super interesting. Yeah, definitely.
Well,
send it my way.
I will send a lot your way, Susan. It's been so fun, and you and I mean, this is an example of how long we can converse. I don't know what this podcast will end up getting cut down into, but speaking as of recording, we've recorded for multiple hours at this point. I've had so much fun with you, and many more to come. As a last kind of piece, and I kind of like ending on this, you're obviously in a lot of places. You're on Medium, you're on Substack, you're on LinkedIn, you're everywhere. Where's the best place for people to find you if they they have follow-up questions to this conversation, or just want to reach out to you to learn more about what you're working on?
That is a great question. I am on LinkedIn and Instagram most of the time. Good and Useful on Instagram. Or Tammberlin Vineyards, if you're interested in, like, the wine side of things. But, like, I tend to be on there most, and, like, LinkedIn is a good place to find me and learn about what I'm doing. And a good old fashioned email goes a long way. Good and Useful, GOODNUSEFUL @gmail. Is a great place to find me as well. Maybe someday I'll change that to something that's, like, not quite as colloquial, because I have to spell it, and that's not great for anybody. But that is where, and then also Substack, Good and Useful on Substack is a great place to, like, see stuff. And I have high hopes and, like, good intentions, aspirations to write more there as well.
You're a phenomenal writer, by the way, and I highly recommend people, and we'll include this in the show notes as well, but I would recommend people to check out your Substack. And there's this one, like, Why You Invest in Emerging Managers piece that is so well written, and that was my first foray into, like, the Susan Kimberlin world after Amber introduced us.
This has been amazing too, and I'm just, like, I'm excited to have gotten a chance to do this. I feel quite lucky to be in the set of people as a listener to the podcast as well. I feel like I'm among giants in the space, and I'm learning a lot from you. So it's been, like, such an honor to be here.
Well, I'm among giants, you included, and I'm just like, this tickles my brain in all the right ways, and I will continue to do this for a very long time. So thank you so much, and we'll talk soon.
Sounds good. Thank you. I so appreciate that, and that is so aligned with the podcast.
I want to give a special shout out to today's sponsor, Alchemist Accelerator. Backed by the likes of Coastal Avengers, Mayfield, Salesforce, just to name a few, Alchemist is the top B2B startup accelerator that's been around since 2012, backing founders from day one. And if you've been around for 12 years and running laser focused only on one industry, you build this incredible set of flywheels, and positive feedback loop is absolutely insane. We back the best enterprise talent who go on to change the world in which we live in, who then come back to their hometown, coach, and mentor the next generation of world-class enterprise talent. And don't take it just from me. Alchemist has backed the likes of Launch Darkly, Rigetti, Privacera, Mo Engage, Farmwise, just to name a few, many of which who have come back as mentors and coaches for the current classes of Alchemist. If you're curious and want to get more involved in the Alchemist ecosystem, check out alchemistaccelerator.com/superclusters. That's an S at the beginning and S at the end, and we'll include the link in the show notes below. Till next, stay awesome. Hey Superclusters fans, David from Post here, and if you're tuning in from Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever podcasts find your ear, it'd mean the world to me if you left a review. For those from the YouTube universe, let me know if you agree or disagree in the comments, and it'd mean a lot to me if you could share this episode with just one other person who'd get a kick out of today's topics. I'm on the road to publishing to at least 100 episodes of Superclusters, so every comment, question, review helps me make this experience more helpful, exciting, and fun for you. And lastly, I want to share a quick disclaimer. The views expressed in this episode are for informational purposes only and are solely the views of myself and the guest alone. They are not representative of Alchemist Accelerator. None of the views expressed herein constitute legal, investment, business, or tax advice. Any allusions or references to funds or companies are for illustrative purposes only and should not be relied upon as investment recommendations. Consult a professional investment advisor prior to making any investment decisions. And that's all from me. See you on the next.